Alright, today we're diving into one of history's most notorious institutions, the Spanish Inquisition. You hear that name, and immediately your mind goes to images of torture chambers, heretics in chains, and the terror that gripped medieval Spain. It's been painted as one of the most brutal chapters in history, but there's way more to the story. So let's peel back the layers and look at what really happened. A lot of what people believe about the Inquisition is way off. I'm going to break down the myths, the facts, and the real motivations that fueled this infamous institution. First off, let's set the stage here. We're talking about 15th century Spain, a country that's just unified under Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. They're fresh off a huge military win, driving out the Muslim rulers who'd controlled parts of Spain for centuries. It was a time of huge shifts, politically, socially, and religiously. Spain's rulers were aiming for a unified Christian nation, and this idea wasn't just a political move. Religion was the core of identity back then. So yeah, they wanted everyone on the same page religiously. So let's talk about what Henry Kamen, one of the main historians who's tackled the Inquisition, has to say. We think of the Inquisition as some massive witch hunt, but he argues it wasn't as widespread or bloody as it's often portrayed. Sure, it was powerful, but it wasn't as all-consuming as people might think. He even says there were rules to it. It wasn't some chaotic free-for-all where they just went after anyone and everyone. The Spanish Inquisition officially started in 1478, and it was pretty focused on certain groups. Ferdinand and Isabella were primarily concerned with a group known as conversos. These were Jews who had converted to Christianity, either willingly or under pressure. Spain had a history of tolerating different religions, but now there was this fear, this paranoia, that some of these conversos weren't genuinely Christian. People thought they were practicing Judaism in secret. That's where the Inquisition really comes in. Now, here's something crazy. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't this Spanish invention. They actually borrowed a lot of the structure and ideas from the Catholic Church's previous Inquisitions. But the Spanish version was unique because it wasn't controlled by the Pope. Ferdinand and Isabella basically took control, making it a tool of the state. They wanted to use it to enforce religious unity and loyalty to the crown. So we're talking about a mix of religious and political motives. So here's another twist. Kamen points out that while there were horrific punishments, the whole burning at the stake thing we think of, yeah, it happened, but it was relatively rare. And the Inquisition actually operated with a lot of written rules and procedures. They had to investigate thoroughly before sentencing anyone. They kept records of trials, and not everyone was found guilty. It wasn't like they just dragged people off the streets and threw them into some dungeon. Trials were kind of like public performances. The goal was to make people afraid, yeah, but also to make an example of those who threatened society's unity. They had these rituals, like auto da fe, which was like a public ceremony where they'd announce punishments. A lot of times, these trials were more about humiliation than torture. The Inquisition used fear and shame as weapons, just as much as physical punishment. And here's something that really flips the script. The Inquisition wasn't happening everywhere. It was strongest in certain cities, like Seville and Toledo. But there were huge parts of Spain that saw very little Inquisition activity. In fact, some towns didn't even have a permanent tribunal. So while it was intense, it wasn't some all-consuming force that had its hand in every corner of Spanish life. But alright, let's get real. People did suffer, no doubt. The methods they used to get confessions weren't exactly humane. They used torture, not often, but it happened. The whole point was to break someone's will, to make them confess and give up others. This is where the Inquisition really earns its dark reputation. But what's interesting is, by the standards of the time, it wasn't as crazy as it seems to us now. Torture was sadly normal in European justice systems back then, and the Inquisition actually limited its use compared to some other places. One thing people forget is that Spain wasn't the only country dealing with religious issues. This was a time when Europe was full of religious clashes. The Protestant Reformation was right around the corner, and other countries were doing the same kind of thing, just with different targets. England had its own persecution of Catholics and dissenters. France had religious wars. So in some ways, the Spanish Inquisition wasn't as unique as we think. It was brutal, but it wasn't happening in a vacuum. And here's the wildest part. The Inquisition lasted way longer than people realize. Officially, it didn't end until the 19th century, though by that point it was more symbolic than anything. The fact that it lasted so long shows just how deeply ingrained it was. It went through phases. It wasn't as deadly in its later years, but it stuck around as a way to control religious ideas and keep Spain unified. So, the takeaway here is, yeah, the Spanish Inquisition was brutal, but it's not as simple as the stories make it out to be. It was a tool of control, absolutely, but it wasn't as all-encompassing or random as we've been led to believe. It was methodical, limited in scope, and very much about keeping a tight grip on the nation. Kamen argues that its dark legend became exaggerated over time, and while there's truth to it, we've got to remember the bigger picture. Spain was trying to create a unified Christian identity in a crazy, divided Europe. Not saying it was right, but when you look at it through that lens, you get a more realistic view of what went down. So, next time someone says nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, maybe you can surprise them with some real history. Thanks for watching, folks, and stay curious.